The storm outside was relentless, pounding against the windows like a desperate visitor seeking entry. The wind howled through the trees, and lightning illuminated the lonely suburban street where Claire parked her car. She checked the address again, a large Victoria home on the outskirts of town. It was exactly as described by the family who had hired her. Claire was no stranger to pet sitting. As a college student, it was an easy way to make extra money. Feed the animals, take them on a walk, and spend the night to keep them company. It was simple, but something about this particular job felt different. She stepped out her car, pulling her coat tight around her as the cold air bit at her skin. The house loomed in the darkness, its old wooden exterior appearing almost skeletal in the flickering streetlight. She hesitated before walking up the steps. The homeowners, a wealthy couple named the Holloways, had given her clear instructions. They were leaving for a weekend trip, and she was to care for their dog, Murphy. "He's friendly," Mrs. Holloway had assured her over phone, "but he gets nervous around strangers. Just talk to him, let him get used to you." Claire knocked. No answer. She rang the doorbell. Still nothing. Then a sudden noise, a soft scratching from inside. Claire's stomach tightened. Just a dog, she told herself. He must have been waiting near the door. She pulled the spare key from under mat, just as Mrs. Holloway had instructed, and let herself in. The house smelled of old wood and lavender, a strange but oddly comforting mix. She turned on the hallway light, revealing a grand interior, high ceilings, antique furniture, and large oil paintings of grim-faced ancestors staring down at her. Then she saw him, Murphy, a golden retriever, sitting stiffly at the base of the staircase. His ears were perked, his dark eyes locked onto hers. "Hey, buddy," Claire whispered, crouching down and offering her hand. Murphy didn't move. She stepped closer. "It's okay. I'm here to take care of you." Murphy slowly rose, his tail low, and sniffed her hand cautiously. After a moment, he nudged her fingers, allowing her to pet his soft fur. She exhaled in relief. The house was eerily silent. The only sounds were the ticking of a grandfather clock down the hall, and the occasional rustling of tree branches against the windows. She followed the instructions the Holloways had left. Feed Murphy, check the back doors, and stay in the guest room on the second floor. As she finished up in the kitchen, Murphy's behavior became strange. He sat by the basement door, ears pressed back, letting out a low, uneasy growl. "What is it?" Claire asked, but Murphy didn't budge. His gaze remained fixed on the door, his tail tucked between his legs. A sudden thud from the other side made her jump. She spun around, her heart hammering in her chest. The sound had been deep, like something heavy shifting. The Holloways hadn't mentioned anything about the basement, but basements were always creepy. Old pipes, shifting wood. Nothing out of the ordinary. Still, Murphy refused to move, his growl deepening. Claire shook off the unease and grabbed his leash. "Come on, buddy, let's go upstairs." Murphy hesitated before finally following her up to the guest room. She settled into bed, scrolling through her phone to distract herself. The wind outside had died down, leaving an unsettling quiet in its place. She glanced at Murphy, who lay on the floor near the door, ears still alert. Then tap, tap, tap. Claire's breath hitched. The sound was faint but distinct, knocking. She swallowed, listening intently. It wasn't coming from the front door. It was coming from inside the house. Murphy let out a soft whimper, his body stiff. Claire's fingers tightened around her phone as she forced herself to sit up. The knocking stopped. Her pulse thundered in her ears. Had she imagined it? Then a new sound, footsteps. Soft, deliberate, moving slowly along the hallway just outside her door. Claire's throat tightened. The Holloways weren't supposed to be home until Sunday. Her eyes darted to the door. It was closed, but not locked. Murphy suddenly rose to his feet, his posture tense, his growl rumbling low in his chest. Then, the doorknob began to turn. Claire clamped a hand over her mouth, her entire body frozen with fear. She watched, wide-eyed, as the handle twisted, the old brass creaking against the wood. The door didn't open. It just turned, slowly, methodically, before stopping. A long silence followed. Then a whisper, a voice on the other side. so soft she almost didn't hear it. "Who's watching you?" Claire's breath hitched, and she grabbed Murphy's collar, pulling him close. She had two choices: stay still and hope whoever was outside would leave, or grab her phone and call for help. Her shaking fingers fumbled as she reached for her phone, but as soon as she unlocked it, the doorknob snapped back into place. Silence. Claire's heart pounded so hard she thought it might burst from her chest. She waited, listened, nothing. Then a sudden scratching noise, not at the door this time, but from inside the room. Claire's breath hitched as she slowly turned her head. The closet. It was slightly open, just a sliver of darkness visible through the gap. Murphy whimpered, inching closer to her, his body trembling. Claire stared, paralyzed. She had checked the closet earlier. It had been empty, but now she wasn't so sure. The closet door stood slightly open, revealing only a thin sliver of darkness. Claire sat frozen, her breath shallow, her heart hammering so violently she swore whoever or whatever was inside could hear it. Murphy whimpered beside her, his body pressed against her leg, as if seeking protection. Her mind raced. She had checked the closet before bed. It had been empty. Had she imagined the sound? Maybe the old house was just settling. Maybe the wind. Then the door moved. Not a lot, just the tiniest shift, as though something inside had pressed against it. Claire clamped a hand over her mouth, suppressing the gasp that tried to escape. This wasn't her imagination. Something was in there. The soft scratching started again, faint but unmistakable. It sounded deliberate, like nails dragging against wood. She grabbed her phone, thumb hovering over the screen. Should she call the police? The Holloways? Before she could decide, Murphy growled low in his throat, his fur bristling. Then bang! The closet door slammed shut on its own. Claire let out a strangled scream and scrambled backward onto the bed, clutching Murphy's collar. Her phone slipped from her hands, tumbling onto the floor. Silence. Claire stared at the closet, her entire body trembling. The air in the room felt wrong, thick and heavy, pressing down on her like an unseen force. Then, ever so softly, a whisper seeped from behind the door. "You're not supposed to be here." Claire's stomach lurched. The voice was right there, so close, too close. She bolted from the bed, yanking Murphy's leash as she lunged for the door. She didn't care about her bag, her phone, nothing. She had to get out. She twisted the doorknob, her sweaty fingers slipping as she yanked it open. The hallway stretched before her, dark and empty. Without looking back, she ran. Murphy followed, his nails clicking frantically against the hardwood as they fled down the stairs. As she reached the front door, she fumbled with the locks, her hands shaking. Finally, she ripped the door open and stumbled out into the cold night air, gasping for breath. She turned, expecting to see someone standing in the doorway, but the house was still. The only movement was a light curtain swaying gently from an open upstairs window. Her mind screamed at her to leave, drive away, never look back. But then, a sound, a soft whimper. Claire's blood ran cold. Murphy wasn't whimpering. He was standing right beside her, silent. The sound was coming from inside the house. A voice, small, fragile. A child's voice. "Help me?" Claire's breath caught in her throat. It was coming from the basement. She looked down at Murphy, who stared at her, ears alert but no longer growling. Her pulse thundered in her ears. Every instinct screamed at her to run. Leave. Forget. Never come back. But that voice, it was weak, pleading. It sounded real. Claire swallowed hard. She couldn't just leave. Not if someone was down there. Her fingers clenched into fists as she made a decision she knew she would regret. She stepped back inside. The air inside felt different, colder than before. The door creaked as it shut behind her, muffling the outside world. Murphy followed, his posture tense but no longer resisting. Claire forced her legs to move, stepping cautiously toward the basement door. The silence pressed in around her. She reached out, her hand trembling as she gripped the handle. She turned it. The door swung open. A rush of stale, cold air hit her face. The basement stairs yawned before her, vanishing into darkness. Murphy whimpered, but didn't back away. Claire took a breath, summoning what little courage she had left. She took the first step down, then the second. The wooden stairs creaked under her weight, the sound unnaturally loud in the stillness. As she descended, the shadows seemed to thicken around her. The weak light from the hallway barely reached beyond the first few steps. Somewhere below, movement, a faint shuffling. Then the whispering returned, soft, indistinct. But there, Claire swallowed hard and reached the bottom. The basement was massive, stretching far wider than she'd expected. The air was damp, the walls lined with old wooden shelves cluttered with forgotten belongings. Her eyes scanned the darkness. Then, in the farthest corner, she saw it. A small figure, a child, a girl, no older than 7 or 8, sitting with her knees pulled to her chest. Her long hair obscured her face, and she was rocking slightly, whispering something over and over. Claire's breath caught. "Hey, are you okay?" The girl didn't respond. Claire took a cautious step closer. "I heard you call for help. What are you doing down here?" Murphy let out a low whimper, his tail stiff. The girl stopped rocking. A long, painful silence followed. Then, in a slow, unnatural motion, the girl lifted her head. Claire's stomach dropped. The girl's face was wrong. Her eyes were too wide, too dark, bottomless pits that reflected nothing. Her mouth stretched in an unnatural grin, as if her lips had been carved open, and then she moved, not like a child, not like a human. She lurched forward, impossibly fast. Claire screamed, stumbling backward, knocking over a pile of old boxes. She hit the ground hard, pain jolting through her side. Murphy barked, loud, aggressive, but the girl didn't stop. She crawled toward Claire, her limbs contorting, her face locked in that awful, grinning stare. Then, the basement light flickered on, and she was gone. The space where the girl had been was now empty. Nothing remained except dust and silence. Claire scrambled to her feet, heart hammering. She grabbed Murphy's leash and ran. She didn't stop until she was outside again, gasping for air. The house stood quiet, its windows dark and empty. The basement door had closed on its own. Claire didn't wait for answers. She grabbed her keys, threw open her car door, and sped away into the night, never looking back. But as she drove, her rearview mirror caught something that made her blood turn to ice. In the back seat, just for a second, she saw a wide, grinning face. Then it was gone. Claire didn't stop driving until she was miles away from the Holloway house. Her knuckles were white against the steering wheel, her breath coming in short, panicked gasps. Murphy lay curled in the passenger seat, his ears flattened, his body still trembling. Her mind was a jumbled mess of fear and disbelief. Had she really seen that thing in the basement? And the face in the rearview mirror, was that real, or was her mind playing tricks on her? She pulled into a nearly empty gas station, her hands still shaking as she turned off the engine. The fluorescent lights above cast a harsh glow over the pavement, making the world feel a little more real, a little less nightmarish. Claire exhaled, trying to steady herself. She needed to think. She reached for her phone to call the Holloways, but then she remembered. She had left it behind. A cold dread settled in her stomach. Her phone was still in that house. She glanced at Murphy, who was staring at her with wide, uncertain eyes. Going back was unthinkable, but she had to, not just for her phone, but because something was wrong in that house. That girl in the basement. She had called for help, and as much as Claire wanted to believe she was some kind of hallucination, deep down, she knew she wasn't. She wasn't supposed to be there. That's what the whisper had said. So, who was? Claire swallowed hard, gripping the wheel. She couldn't let this go. Back to the house. The drive back felt twice as long, the darkness pressing in around her car like a living thing. Every shadow on the road made her pulse quicken, and she kept glancing in the rearview mirror, terrified she might see that face again. When she finally reached the Holloway house, it looked different. Before, it had just been an eerie old house. Now it felt alive, watching, waiting. She hesitated at the curb, gripping the steering wheel so tightly her fingers ached. Murphy let out a soft whimper. "It's okay, buddy," she whispered, even though it wasn't. Taking a deep breath, she stepped out of the car. The night was eerily still. No wind, no crickets, just a suffocating silence that made her skin crawl. The front door was still unlocked from when she had fled. It creaked open slowly, revealing the dark interior. Claire's heart pounded. Every instinct screamed at her to run, but she forced herself forward. The house was silent. Too silent. She tiptoed toward the guest room, her breath shallow. Her phone was on the floor where she had dropped it. She grabbed it quickly, feeling a wave of relief as the screen lit up. 7 missed calls from Mom. 1 new voicemail. She didn't have time to check them now. Just as she turned to leave, a soft creak echoed from upstairs. Claire froze. The sound was slow, deliberate, footsteps. She wasn't alone. Murphy let out a deep, uneasy growl. Claire's pulse thundered as she turned toward the staircase. Something was up there. Then, from the darkness above, a whisper, "You're not supposed to be here." Claire's blood turned to ice. She couldn't move, couldn't breathe. Then, something darted across the hallway upstairs. A shadow, fast, inhumanly fast. Claire bolted. She grabbed Murphy's leash and ran, her footsteps slamming against the floor as she hurtled toward the front door. But as she reached it, it slammed shut on its own. Claire yanked at the handle, panic surging through her. It wouldn't budge. Behind her, the footsteps came down the stairs. Slow, deliberate, coming for her. She spun around, pressing herself against the door. And then she saw it. A figure stood at the base of the stairs. The girl, her face still locked in that horrible, too wide grin. Only now, her eyes weren't empty. They were filled with rage. And she wasn't alone. Behind her, more shadows loomed in the darkness. Unmoving, watching. Claire's breath came in short, sharp gasps. Then the girl spoke. But it wasn't her voice. It was a dozen voices, layered and distorted, whispering all at once. "You shouldn't have come back." The lights flickered violently. Murphy barked, snapping Claire from her paralysis. She spun, grabbing for the nearest object, a heavy lamp from the side table, and hurled it at the girl. The second it left her hands, the light bulbs exploded. Darkness swallowed the room. And then a scream, high-pitched, unnatural, filled with pure, soul-ripping rage. Claire didn't wait to see what happened next. She turned and ran for the back door. This time, it flew open the second she touched it. She and Murphy burst into the night, the cold air hitting her like a slap. She didn't stop running until she was back in her car. She threw it into reverse, tires screeching as she sped away from the house. As she turned onto Main Road, she risked one last glance in the rearview mirror. The Holloway house stood dark and silent, except for the upstairs window, where the girl stood watching her, still grinning, still whispering. And then she raised her hand and waved. Claire didn't stop driving until she reached the first gas station she could find. The neon lights flickered against the wet pavement, casting long, jittery shadows. She pulled into the lot, breathing hard, her pulse still hammering for what she had just witnessed. Murphy sat stiffly in the passenger seat, his ears still pinned back, his body tense. He hadn't stopped trembling since they left the house. Claire parked and slumped against the steering wheel, trying to steady her breath. Every inch of her body was screaming with exhaustion and fear. But there was something else, too. A gnawing, horrible curiosity. That girl in the house. She wasn't just some nightmare. She was real, and so were the things lurking in the shadows behind her. Claire had always believed in logic, but what she had just experienced defied it. She needed answers. Her phone buzzed against her lap. The missed calls from her mom. The voicemail. Her fingers were stiff as she pressed play. A low static hissed through the speaker before her mom's voice came through, tense and urgent. "Claire, honey, I saw your last text about the Holloways. Listen to me. Don't go back to that house. Call me the second you get this." A pause. Then, her mother's voice dropped lower. "It's happening again." The message ended abruptly. Claire's stomach clenched. Again? What the hell did that mean? She scrolled through her contacts and called her mother. The line rang once, twice, then, click. Mom. Claire's voice came out hoarse. A pause. Then, Claire. Her mother sounded breathless. Oh, thank God. Tell me you're not there. I'm not, Claire said quickly. But something's wrong with that house. Something is in there, Mom. I saw. Listen to me very carefully, her mother interrupted, her voice edged with panic. I need you to leave it alone. Do not go back. Do you hear me? Claire swallowed. Mom, what do you know about that house? Silence. Then her mother whispered something Claire could barely hear. They never left. Claire's grip tightened on the phone. Who? Who never left? Her mother inhaled shakily. You need to come home. Claire, we'll talk then. But promise me you won't go back. Claire hesitated. Her mother had always been rational, skeptical. But now, she sounded genuinely afraid. Okay, Claire murmured. I promise. She hung up, staring blankly at her reflection in the rear-view mirror. And then, a shape moved behind her, a figure in the back seat. Claire screamed and spun around, but the seat was empty. Murphy barked sharply, snapping her out of it. Her hands were shaking. Had she imagined it, or was something still following her? She needed to know the truth, and there was only one place to find it. Not at home, not from her mother, but from the Holloways. The Holloways' secret. Claire pulled into the Holloways' driveway the next morning. The house looked less menacing in the daylight, but the unease in her stomach hadn't left. Murphy whined softly as she stepped out of the car, but she gave him a reassuring pat. Stay here, buddy. I won't be long. She made her way up the steps and rang the doorbell. A moment later, Mrs. Holloway answered. Her expression was polite, but guarded. Claire, what are you doing back here? Claire hesitated, gripping the strap of her bag. I need to ask you something about this house. Mrs. Holloway's face didn't change, but her knuckles whitened where she gripped the doorframe. You should go home, dear, she said, voice soft but firm. You had a long night. We really appreciate you watching Murphy, but who is the girl in the basement? Claire blurted. Mrs. Holloway froze. The air between them turned cold. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Then Mrs. Holloway sighed and stepped aside. Come in. Claire followed her into the kitchen. The house felt different now, tense, suffocating, as though something unseen was listening. Mrs. Holloway poured herself a cup of tea, her hands slightly unsteady. We don't talk about the basement, she said finally. Claire's skin prickled. Why not? The older woman took a slow sip before answering. Because acknowledging them only makes them stronger. Claire swallowed. Them? Mrs. Holloway's eyes lifted to hers. The whispering ones. The name sent a violent shiver down Claire's spine. Mrs. Holloway set down her cup, staring into the dark liquid, as if it held memories she didn't want to recall. This house, it used to belong to the Greaves family. A long time ago. They had a daughter, Emily. She was just 8 years old when she went missing. Claire's stomach twisted. She disappeared? Mrs. Holloway nodded. One day, she just vanished. The police searched the house for weeks, but they never found a trace of her. And then, not long after, the whisper started. Claire felt her pulse spike. What do you mean? Mrs. Holloway's eyes darkened. Voices from the walls, from the closets, from the basement. A chill crawled over Claire's skin. Mrs. Holloway continued, her voice barely above a whisper. Some say Emily never left, that she was taken, and whatever took her is still here. The house seemed to groan softly around them, as if it was listening. Claire's breath hitched. You know something is in this house, don't you? Mrs. Holloway nodded. And yet you still live here? The older woman gave a sad smile. You can't leave something that's already inside you. The words sent a wave of nausea through Claire. Then, a noise, a soft, rhythmic tapping, coming from the ceiling. Mrs. Holloway's expression did not change. Neither did her voice as she said, They know you're here. The tapping turned into scratching. Claire's hands trembled. And then, from upstairs, a whisper, "You're not supposed to be here." The same voice from the basement. But this time, it was right above her. The whisper slithered through the air, curling into Claire's ears like a breath against her skin. "You're not supposed to be here." The same voice from the basement. But this time, it came from the ceiling. Claire's heart slammed against her ribs. The scratching above them grew more frantic, nails raking against the wood. Murphy, still outside in the car, began barking wildly. Mrs. Holloway didn't move, didn't even flinch. She simply lifted her teacup with trembling hands, took a sip, and whispered, "They've noticed you now." Claire forced herself to swallow the lump in her throat. "What do they want?" Mrs. Holloway's gaze flickered toward the staircase. Her lips parted slightly, as if she were about to answer. Then the lights flickered. Once, twice, and then darkness. A sudden, deep silence filled the house. The air turned heavy, suffocating. Claire couldn't see anything, but she could feel it. Something was in the room with them. Not just one thing. Many. Then, from the shadows, a giggle, high-pitched, childlike. Claire's blood ran cold. The sound came from a hallway. And then footsteps. Not heavy, deliberate ones. Small, bare feet, running, straight toward her. Claire stumbled back. Her breath caught in her throat. The footsteps stopped just in front of her. She couldn't see anything, but she could feel something there. A presence. Cold fingers brushed against her arm. And then, a voice right beside her ear. "Help me?" Claire's entire body locked up. The child's voice was not alone. It was layered, twisted, spoken over itself a dozen times in different tones, different ages, some male, some female, some not even human. Then a hand grabbed her wrist, and everything changed. The Holloway house's truth. For a brief, horrible moment, Claire wasn't in the kitchen anymore. She was somewhere else, underground. The walls were made of cold, wet stone. The air smelled of damp earth and something rotten. She was in a tunnel, a long, endless tunnel, stretching into the darkness. And she wasn't alone. Figures crawled along the walls and ceiling, their bodies moving in unnatural ways, twisting, bending, snapping. Their eyes black, hollow pits. Their mouths open too wide, whispering, not words, names. They were calling to her. And then she saw her. Emily, the little girl from the basement. She stood in the tunnel, her white nightgown stained with something dark. Her face was blank, expressionless, but her mouth moved, shaping silent words. Claire couldn't hear them. And then Emily lifted her hand and pointed behind her. Claire turned and saw it, a door in the stone wall, massive, old, bleeding. From beneath it, something pressed against the wood, a shape, something trying to get out. The whispering grew louder. Claire's ears rang, her vision blurred. Then, a single word slammed into her mind like a scream. Run. And suddenly, Claire was back in the Holloway's kitchen. The lights were on. The house was still, but the air was wrong. Mrs. Holloway was standing exactly where she had been, staring at Claire with dark, sunken eyes. "You saw it, didn't you?" she whispered. Claire swallowed hard. Her body was shaking. Her wrist burned where something had grabbed her. "What is it?" she rasped. Mrs. Holloway's lips parted. She spoke in a voice not entirely her own. "The thing that waits below." Claire took a slow step back. Her mind raced. What had she just seen? She didn't know what was behind that door, but she knew one thing. It wanted out. And if the Holloways had been feeding it, keeping it satisfied, what would happen if it got hungry? Claire didn't wait to find out. She turned and ran. Out of the house. Down the steps. Straight to her car where Murphy waited, barking frantically. She threw the door open, jumped in, and peeled away from the house, tires screeching. As she glanced in the rearview mirror, she saw the Holloway house one last time. Mrs. Holloway stood at the doorway, watching her go, and behind her, at the upstairs window, Emily, still smiling. still whispering, as if she knew Claire would never truly leave. Because once you've heard the whispering ones, they never stop calling you back.